An unpublished chapter of Hawaiian history from Harper's New Monthly Magazine, September 1883, a true first-hand account by James Fowle Baldwin Marshall. From 1838 until 1843, the Hawaiian Islands were a bone of contention. Intrigues were constantly set on foot by agents and subjects of France and England, having their object the subversion of the native government and the seizure of the islands. In 1839, the French compelled the king, Kamehameha III, to comply with certain unwarrantable demands and as a security for future good behavior to deposit $20,000. It was thought that the demand was made in expectation that the king would be unable to comply, and that thus the French would have an excuse to seize the group of islands. The American merchants came forward and raised the sum, and the peril was for the time averted. But the plots continued, and in 1842, the British consul, Richard Charlton, a coarse and illiterate man, incited by an ambitious adventurer, one Alexander Simpson, endeavored to involve the native government in difficulties that would result in hoisting the British flag over the group. In the same year, Sir George Simpson, governor of the Hudson Bay Company's territories, visited the islands. An English gentleman of liberal views, he would not lend himself to the intrigues of his countrymen, albeit one of them was his nephew, and by his advice the king, harassed on all sides, decided to send commissioners to the United States, England, and France to try to obtain, if possible, a definite acknowledgement of his kingdom and sovereignty. To this important embassy were appointed Reverend William Richards, formerly one of the American missionaries, but who had been for some time acting as advisor to the king, and Ha'alilio, a native chief. They quietly embarked on a small schooner for Mazatlan and crossed Mexico to Veracruz. As soon as it was known that they had left the islands on this mission, the British consul, Charlton, also secretly embarked for London via Mexico to lay his complaints before the British government, leaving Simpson as deputy to carry out their joint designs, whom, however, the Hawaiian government declined to recognize. On the Mexican coast, Charlton fell in with Lord George Paulet, commanding Her British Majesty's frigate, the Carrisfort, and made his lordship, as his course afterward showed, a convert to his schemes, and by his formal and plausible complaints against the king induced Rear Admiral Thomas, commanding the British squadron on that station, to order the Carrisfort to Honolulu for the purpose of investigating the alleged grievances. On his arrival, Lord Paulet, a hot-headed young nobleman, readily lent himself to the designs of Simpson without inquiring into the merits of the case, dazzled by the idea of so early in his career making a brilliant stroke for his country and extending her drumbeat round the world by one more station. Making outrageous demands upon the king at the cannon's mouth, compliance with which he knew would be impossible, he required as an alternative the immediate cessation of the kingdom to England, or he would open fire upon the city and declare war in the name of Great Britain. In his terrible crisis, the proclamation issued by this native king to his people is so touching and so king-like that I will quote it here. "Where are you, chiefs, people, and commons from my ancestors, and people from foreign lands? Hear ye. I make known to you that I am in perplexity by reason of difficulties into which I have been brought without cause. Therefore, I have given away the life of our land. Hear ye. But my rule over you, my people, and your privileges will continue, for I have hope that the life of the land will be restored when my conduct is justified. Done at Honolulu, Oahu, this 25th day of February, 1843, Kamehameha III, Ke'ekauluohi." Lord Paulet took formal possession of the islands, installing himself as governor of Her Majesty's new dominion, destroyed every Hawaiian flag he could get hold of, and placed an embargo on every native vessel so that no one could go out and carry the news. An American man of war, the Boston, Captain Long, had come in a few days before the session. Captain Quackenbush, late of Norfolk, Virginia, was then a midshipman on board of her. The Americans were very indignant. They had their guns double-shotted in hopes of an opportunity to interfere, but being on a cruise could not go out of their way to carry the news and could only remain neutral. Lord Paulet would thus have cruelly prevented the king from communicating with his ambassadors who were abroad successfully working for the acknowledgement of his independence, hoping to commit the home government to an acceptance of this voluntary cession at the cannon's mouth before the other side of the story could be represented to it. His young lordship and Simpson chuckled over the success of the stroke by which they had, as they supposed, closed every avenue of egress for Hawaiian vessels, and secured the arrival of their own dispatches in England in advance of every other version of the story. Yankee shrewdness was, however, too much for his lordship's plans. It happened that the king had chartered his own yacht, Ho'ikaika Swift Runner, previously to the cession to an American house for a voyage to Mazatlan and back. Lord Paulet, anxious to get possession of the only creditable craft at the islands in order to send Simpson as his bearer of dispatches to England by the speediest way, and being prevented by its charter from seizing the vessel without the consent of the American house, offered, in case they would relinquish their charter, to allow him to send an agent on the ship to attend to their business on the coast and bring down any freight on the return trip, thereby saving them the whole expense of the charter. It must be remembered that in those days, communication between the islands of the Pacific and the coast were very infrequent, depending on merchant ships that came from Boston twice a year, and except for occasional chance vessels. Lord Paulet rightly conjectured that the Yankee merchants would jump at the offer to have all their business transacted at his expense, but he little dreamed of all the use that might be made of the opportunity he was giving them. The officers of the Boston, who would have been glad of an excuse for a forcible interference with his lordship's plans, not being allowed that pleasure, consoled themselves by giving a ball on board, to which the officers of the Carrisfort were not invited. I was then a young merchant in Honolulu, and attended the ball with many other of the American residents. At its height, I was quietly invited into the cabin of the Boston, where I found Captain Long, Dr. Judd, previously a prominent American missionary, then acting as the king's minister, and other influential citizens and warm friends of the king. Here I was told of the king's desire to send an envoy to England to present his protest against Lord Paulet's act of violence, and his answer to the charges against him, and to demand the restitution of his sovereignty. I was informed also of the opportunity offered to the firm of Ladd & Company of sending a messenger to the coast in the yacht. Ladd & Company, who were warm friends of the island government, had proposed that the king should send a secret ambassador in the character of their commercial agent, thus turning Lord Paulet's masterstroke against himself in the neatest possible way. I was asked if I would go in this double capacity of ostensible supercargo and actual minister plenipotentiary. Mr. Charles Brewer, who was one of the council, a noble-hearted man with whom I was about associating myself in business, now enjoyed a green old age in Boston, not only gave consent to my going, but agreed to advance for the king the necessary funds and take his pay in firewood, all the king's other revenues having been cut off. I readily accepted the commission. No time was to be lost. Lord Paulet had rechristened the Ho'ikaika as Her Majesty's Tender Albert and was fitting her out with all passable dispatch. The king and his premier, a princess almost equal in rank, without whose signature none of his acts was valid, had left the island of Oahu immediately upon the cession, and in sullen dignity of despair buried themselves among the mountains of the adjacent island of Maui, leaving Dr. Judd, his minister, to represent and protect his interests, a man of indomitable courage, unusual ability, and unflinching devotion to his sovereign. Those happy isles in that day did not boast a lawyer. My credentials were copied verbatim, except necessary variations from an old blue book containing the credentials of John Adams as the first American minister to England. Mine were a commission as Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary to the Court of St. James from the native king of the Hawaiian Islands. The title Kamehameha was allowed by Lord Paulet to retain, with some half-dozen other blank commissions signed by the king and premier, to be filled out by myself for other countries as occasion might require. These were rendered necessary by the uncertainty of my finding the king's other ambassadors, Ha'alilio and Richards, with whom, in case I did find them, I was to associate myself. The papers were drawn up by Dr. Judd and a confidential clerk at midnight in the royal tomb in Honolulu, with the king's coffin for a table. So secret was it necessary to keep the transaction that even this clerk was not trusted with the name of the ambassador, which was left to be inserted by myself after I had sailed. The papers prepared, a canoe with picked crew of Kanakas was dispatched from a distant point of the island to summon His Majesty and his suite to a midnight council. Crossing the boisterous channel in this frail conveyance, they landed at midnight on the shores of Waikiki, a suburb of Honolulu, and in its coconut grove, by the light of torches, my credentials received the signature and seal of the king and his kuhina nui, great minister, KAMALEHUA, the big mouth queen. Then the king and his attendants returned to their mountains without Lord Paulette having a suspicion that they had ever left them. The American consul at Honolulu took advantage of the opportunity also to make me the bearer of his dispatches to Washington with details of the session, which would, of course, have momentous interest to the American government and the protest of the American residents against the act of Lord Paulette. All the hurried preparations being completed, Her British Majesty's tender Albert sailed on the 11th day of March 1843 for San Blas, commanded by a midshipman from the Caris Fort and 2 old men-of-war's men, with a crew of 8 Kanakas and 2 passengers, one of whom was Mr. Alexander Simpson, late Deputy Consul, now special bearer of dispatches to Her Majesty from the governor of the Sandwich Islands, the other one, myself. After a 30 days voyage, we landed at San Blas on the 10th of April and engaged our mules and guides for Tepic, the city 30 miles inland, of which San Blas is the seaport. It is a handsome city, healthy and pleasantly situated on high ground. We reached it the following day and were received with princely hospitality by the British Consul General, Mr. Barron, a wealthy merchant who had married a Mexican lady of rank and was a very influential citizen. I had been his guest 3 years before on my first trip across Mexico to the United States and had received many attentions from him. All the way over, Mr. Simpson had been pouring out upon the young midshipman commander, who had plenty of time to converse while his old tars took care of the ship, his expectations of the lionizing he should receive at Tepic. He lost no time to inform the Consul General, with no little self-complacency, of the glorious news that the Hawaiian Islands were under the British flag through their voluntary cession by the king. Mr. Barron listened in unconcealed amazement to this startling and excited statements, appearing to notice from time to time the utter silence which I maintained all the while. When they were finished, he rose and invited me into his private office, as if on the business of Ladd & Company, whose agent he was. Arrived in his private office, Mr. Barron requested me to give him a full statement of the remarkable affair, which he was convinced must have another side from that which Mr. Simpson had so fluently set forth. Knowing that I was speaking to an honorable man with the Briton's love of fair play, I did exactly what I was asked to do, explaining the facts of the case, and that of the king, far from having made a voluntary cession of his domain, as stated by Mr. Simpson, had made one under protest to save bloodshed. I showed him my own commission from His Majesty and his protest against this outrage to the Queen of England and request for redress and the restoration of his sovereignty. I told him that the officers of the Hudson Bay Company and other leading Englishmen in Honolulu disapproved of the outrage, and that any fair tribunal would dismiss as baseless the charges against the king upon which the demands had been made. I explained that, under this pressure, the king had made the cession under protest, relying upon the justice and magnanimity of England for investigation, restitution of his rights, and restoration to his throne. Mr. Barron thanked me for the information I had given him and assured me that he would take the same pains to forward me on my way to England that he did to send Mr. Simpson, promising at the same time to keep my secret from him. Returning to the parlor, he said to Mr. Simpson, "This is indeed very great news that you have brought, and much as I should be pleased to have you stay and partake of our hospitalities, it is of the utmost importance that you reach England without delay. I will have your mules and muleteer and guide in readiness for you to start early tomorrow morning." Turning to me, he said, in a way not to excite Simpson's suspicion, "As you will have plenty of time here, would you not like to take a trip to the city of Mexico? If so, you can go with Mr. Simpson, and I can furnish you with the animals." I replied that I should be very glad to go. The ci-devant British consul and prospective governor of the Hawaiian Islands looked somewhat dashed at being so speedily turned off. It was not so much like being lionized as he had expected. In those days, the travel on the west coast of America was by horses and mules, with pack saddles for the baggage. There were no public conveyances. We left Tepic April 12th, reached Guadalajara on the 16th, and on the 21st arrived at Lagos, where we took the diligence for the city of Mexico and arrived on the 25th. The next day, I called the American consul, Mr. Black, and with him on Honorable Waddy Thompson, the American minister, telling them the news I had brought and my own errand. On the 28th, Simpson and I started in diligence for Veracruz. The same day we reached the beautiful Puebla de Los Angeles, City of Angels, where we passed the night. The next day we arrived at Perote, where I met Mr. Southall, bearer of dispatches from Washington to our minister in Mexico, and learned from him my first tidings of the Hawaiian ambassadors, Richards and Ha'alilio, with whom I was to be associated, they having gone to Washington with him. On the 30th, we passed through Jalapa, a beautiful town in a healthy situation, a place of resort for the citizens of Veracruz in seasons of vomito, which I learned was then raging with great violence in the city. But I heard that a vessel was about to sail from there, so kept on my way with Mr. Simpson and reached Veracruz on May Day. Mr. Simpson at once embarked on the English steam packet for Havana. I, having dispatches for Washington, was to take the schooner advertised to sail for New Orleans. Imagine my dismay at learning that their destination had changed. Here was a situation. Vomito raging, my beloved friend the consul on his way to England, and no vessel up for any port. The prospect was not cheering. On May 10th, I sailed for New Orleans in the brig Architect, and after a most vexatious delay at the Balize, waiting for a towboat to cross the bar, we reached New Orleans on the 22nd, 2 hours too late for the daily train for Mobile. Here I was told that I might possibly reach Boston in time for the steamer of June 1st, provided no accident occurred to the mail train. To do so would, however, be to take the quickest time ever made, while delays were the rule rather than the exception. My arrival with the news of the seizure of the islands caused great excitement in New Orleans, where there was already strong feeling against England on account of the affairs of Texas, then fighting for her independence. An interesting circumstance of my brief stay in the city was the accidental discovery of the fate of the first California gold dust ever brought to the States. On May 23rd at 3 p.m., I started in the cars for Lake Pontchartrain, the editor of the New Orleans Picayune accompanying me to interview me on the sensation of the day. After 3 years' absence from my native country, I found myself hurrying through it with no time to visit a fiancé in Mobile or a father and mother in Boston. Arrived at Mobile, however, I found that we had to wait over 6 hours. Fortune was but mocking me. The young lady had sailed the day before for Boston. On May 27th, I found myself in Charleston, greatly elated at having got so far without serious delay. In fact, we reached Charleston 2 days ahead of the mail, which left New Orleans when I did. I felt sure, therefore, of reaching Boston in time for the steamer of June 1st, as there were seldom delays north of Charleston. For the first time in the season, the Charleston steamer failed to make her appearance on time. This blasted my hopes of reaching Boston in time and compelled me to spend the Sabbath in Charleston, somewhat consoled by the thought that the delay would give me 15 days with my family while waiting for the next steamer. I left Charleston May 29th. An alternative still existed of taking a sailing vessel from New York instead of the steamer from Boston, and to miss no possible chance of proceeding on my mission, I passed through Washington without stopping to deliver my dispatches in person, entrusting them to the care of my naval friend Lieutenant Brodie, who pledged himself to deliver them from his own hand to Mr. Legarrette, then acting Secretary of State, which he did in due time. I reached New York June 1st, too late by a quarter of an hour for the London packet ship George Washington. I tried, like my indomitable antitype Mr. Phileas Fogg, to charter a steamer to put me on board of the ship, but was told it was of no use, as she had a fair wind, so refrained from going to this lengths of seizing the steamer and putting her captain in irons, but gave it up and went on to Boston, reaching home June 2nd, to the astonishment of my parents who, having had no warning of my coming, thought I had dropped from the clouds and were almost as much astonished as if I had, when told of my rank and my mission, extraordinary and plenipotentiary. Learning that Daniel Webster, Secretary of State, was then at his Boston residence, I called upon him, June 4th, with James Jackson Jarvis, the well-known art critic and historian of the Sandwich Islands, and Henry A. Pierce, afterward American minister to Hawaii, whose place in a business firm I was about to take on my return to Honolulu. My object in calling on Mr. Webster was to consult him as to my mission and to engage the interest of the United States government. I well remember his majestic presence and the deep, cavernous eyes. He said unequivocally that the United States would interfere if the British government did not disavow the acts of Lord Paulet. To use his own language, "We will await the result of your mission. If England does not then disavow the acts of Lord George Paulet and restore the group, we'll make a fuss." Mr. Webster gave me strong letters to our American ministry at the Court of St. James, the Honorable Edward Everett. On the 14th of June, I embarked at last on the steamer Acadia of the Cunard Line. As we passed down the harbor, she fired a salute of 21 guns for President Tyler, just coming into Boston. We landed at Liverpool June 28th. June 30th, I called on our minister, Mr. Everett, in London. I told him of my errand in England, laid my papers before him, and learned that Mr. Simpson had arrived only 7 days before me. If I had not missed the steamer, I should have been a week in advance of him. As Mr. Everett examined my high-sounding credentials, his habitually grave countenance relaxed in a smile. My papers made me actually outrank himself, as I was made ambassador not only to England, but to any other country of the world. He said, "You are very young to have such an important mission." To which I replied, with becoming modesty, that His Majesty depended on the justice of his cause rather than on the experience of his ambassador. I learned from Mr. Everett that Mr. Richards and Chief Ha'alilio were in Paris, but expected to return soon to London, and he advised me to notify them of my arrival and wait for them there. I did so, taking lodgings at No. 1 Bury Street, St. James, paying the moderate sum for a royal ambassador of 3 shillings and 6pence per day. Mr. Everett had already, I found, had an interview with Lord Aberdeen, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Sir Robert Peel, Prime Minister, on the Hawaiian question, on behalf of the United States. And though England had not officially disavowed the act of Lord George Paulet, we had some intimations that such might be the result. The Queen was waiting to hear the whole story. My first interview with Mr. Everett left me much encouraged with the prospects of my mission. On the 12th of July, not having heard from my associates, with Mr. Everett's advice, I addressed a note to the Earl of Aberdeen, enclosing a copy of my credentials and requesting an interview. The same evening, a flunky in full livery, with a letter for me bearing the seal of the Foreign Office, called at the lodgings of the Minister Plenipotentiary, evidently exalting him greatly in the astonished eyes of his landlady, which were beginning to look with some suspicion upon a lodger of modest bearing, without apparent occupation or visible means of support. The note was from the Undersecretary and read as follows. Mr. Addington presents his compliments to Mr. Marshall and by desire of the Earl of Aberdeen requests that Mr. Marshall will call on Mr. Addington at his office on Friday next at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Foreign Office, 12 July, 1843. I found Mr. Addington very affable in manner. He courteously offered me a chair and a wet blanket, saying that Lord Aberdeen desired him to say to me that the English government could not recognize me as Envoy Extraordinary and Minister Plenipotentiary of the King of the Sandwich Islands, as they knew no such person, the late king having ceded his islands to Great Britain and having therefore no power to appoint envoy to that government. I replied that by the terms of the cession, His Majesty Kamehameha III had retained the title of Native King, by which title I had designated him in my communication to Lord Aberdeen, that I had no anxiety to be, nor much expectation that I should be, recognized as Minister Plenipotentiary and Envoy Extraordinary, but had forwarded my credentials to him simply to show that I was fully empowered to represent the Native King, that if Lord Aberdeen would recognize me as the King's accredited agent and afford me the opportunity of presenting his letters and the proofs which I had of the injustice with which he had been treated and the manner in which he had been compelled to cede his kingdom, my object would be accomplished. Mr. Addington said that the English government had not been desirous of assuming any jurisdiction at the Sandwich Islands or interfering with the king's sovereignty, but that the charges against him were very serious and must be disposed of, or the king must grant redress. I expressed my full confidence that a thorough investigation would dispose them to the satisfaction of the government. I expressed my full confidence that a thorough investigation would dispose them to the satisfaction of the English government. We had a long conversation on the subject of the cession and the circumstances which had led to it, and I left much encouraged by the candid way in which Mr. Addington seemed disposed to consider the matter. Almost as soon as I reached my lodgings after this interview, Mr. Richards and Ha'alilio arrived there. They had come post-haste from Paris on getting my second letter from London, which was the first to reach them. We spent the rest of the day in discussing the startling events which had occurred at the islands since they left, and in laying out our plan of attack upon the British Lion. I took up my quarters thenceforth with the other members of the embassy at St. Paul's Coffee House, St. Paul's Churchyard, from which we laid siege to Downing Street. I called with Mr. Richards at the office of the Hudson Bay Company, all of whom favored the cause of the king, and expressed indignation at the outrages brought about by one who had been in their employ and who was a nephew to so prominent a member of the company as Sir George Simpson. On the 21st, I commenced copying for presentation to the Foreign Office through Mr. Addington, who had agreed at our interview to receive my statements, the long letter of Dr. Judd to the ministers, and portions of the charges brought by the Hawaiian government against Simpson for having violated all the rules of diplomatic courtesy. On the 2nd of July, we were agreeably surprised by the arrival of Mr. Peter A. Brinsmade from Belgium, full of his scheme and then famous Belgian contract for establishing a Belgian colony at the islands. Mr. Brinsmade was one of the partners of Ladd & Company, the American firm at Honolulu, as whose ostensible agent I was enabled to leave the islands, as I have related. Before that event, the king, feeling his inability to cope single-handed with intriguing powers, had given authority to Ladd & Company to form a company of capitalists in Europe and the United States to develop the agricultural resources of the islands and be as a barrier between him and the designs of any foreign nation upon his sovereignty. Mr. Brinsmade, a gentleman of good education and address, had been for a year or more in Europe working for this project and had finally succeeded through the Belgian Company of Colonization. A company had been formed with ample capital and with King Leopold as president. The Belgian government had favored the scheme in the hope of finding a new market for Belgian manufacturers, making investments at the islands and establishing profitable business there, sugar growing, etc. The contract was drawn up by which all the unsold government lands at the islands were to be placed under control of this company, and the stores and warehouses and sugar plantations of Ladd & Company were to be purchased by them. Mr. Brinsmade had informed his partners, Ladd & Company, of his success, and it was to meet him and bring him back to the islands with the first installment of the purchase money that they chartered the king's yacht to go to San Blas. Just as the contract was ready for the signatures, the news of seizure of the islands came like an extinguisher and stopped all proceedings. The firm were under pecuniary embarrassments from which they would have been relieved by this negotiation, and Mr. Brinsmade realized that for them, as for the islands, everything was at stake. His talents had been at the service of Messrs. Richards and Ha'alilio from the time of their arrival, and had been of very great help to them, having written nearly, if not quite all of their dispatches to the governments from which they were seeking recognition of Hawaiian independence. He immediately entered heart and soul with us into the work of presenting our case to the British government. We had also the advice of Sir Henry Pelly, Home Governor of the Hudson Bay Company, who had promised to see Lord Aberdeen personally and urge upon him the prompt consideration of the case. All our dispatches were submitted to him before being sent to the Foreign Office. An amusing dilemma embarrassed us verdant diplomatists at the outset of our proceedings. As I had now, according to my instructions, become associated with Messrs. Richards and Ha'alilio, the dispatches were to be signed by all three of us. We pondered long over the momentous question as to how the Earl of Aberdeen should be addressed in them. The ordinary phrase, "my lord," seemed singular for a plural signature. The native chief suggested that "our lord" would be proper. Our missionary associate thought that savored of irreverence. Another proposed, "O Lord," which was open to the same objection. We finally surmounted the difficulty by considering that our three signatures together meant Kamehameha III, and began it, "my lord," which passed muster with our Hudson Bay House censor. Our method of concocting this momentous document, upon which, as we believed, hung the fate of a nation, was on this wise. All four of us, sitting round a large table in our lodgings under the shadow of St. Paul's, would take up the points one by one, and each write what we thought was the best thing to say, and the best way to say it. Then each would read aloud his own production. But we almost invariably adopted the language of Mr. Brinsmade, who proved himself a born diplomatist, and to whom, for his services in drawing up these dispatches, which were complimented by the Earl of Aberdeen as being remarkably strong and well written, the Hawaiian government owes a debt it has ill repaid. Going in one day to the office of the Hudson Bay Company to leave one of our dispatches for the perusal of Sir Henry Pelly, I found that Mr. Simpson had been in the day before and left one of his "a weak presentment of a weak case" in Sir Henry's estimation. On the 24th of July, we finished our dispatches to Lord Aberdeen, transmitting with them copies of all the documents relating to the session which had passed between Lord George Paulet and the Hawaiian government. On the 7th of August, we sent him a dispatch presenting the defense of the Hawaiian government against the charges made by Lord Paulet and its appeal to the British government and to the British love of justice and fair play for redress. This was acknowledged by Lord Aberdeen to be a very strong document. It took up all of the charges against the government, seriatim, answered and disproved them. 3 days of suspense followed, one of which, my 24th birthday, I spent at the White Hart Inn and visiting Windsor Castle and Hampton Court Palace. We were invited to dine with the great philanthropist Mrs. Elizabeth Fry, who was at that time engaged in her noble efforts for prison reform. I anticipated the meeting with great pleasure, but the sudden illness of Ha'alilio prevented the fulfillment of our engagement. Mrs. Fry, however, sent us a very elegant Bible, which was to have been given to us at the dinner for presentation to His Majesty Kamehameha III. During my stay in London, the Hawaiian Embassy declined all invitations to public receptions, both from the court and the American legation, having no time or money to spare for such occasions. I was in nervous anxiety to conclude our negotiations and get away. There was no Pacific Railroad or Isthmus route in those days, and if I missed the fall trading ship from Boston to Honolulu via Cape Horn, I might have to wait 6 months. On the 9th of September, not having heard from our document, we sent an urgent note to the Earl of Aberdeen requesting an early decision, as Mr. Marshall, one of the commissioners, was compelled to return soon to the islands. Hearing nothing by the 12th, I addressed a note in my own name to Mr. Addington, requesting a private interview with him, and received a prompt reply appointing Monday the 14th. In my interview, I explained my personal reasons for desiring to know as early as possible how far the representations, which, with my associates, I had had the honor to make to the Foreign Office, had exonerated the king from the charges made by Lord Paulet, and whether the decision of the British government could not be given before I returned to the islands. Mr. Addington replied somewhat coldly that our statements had been received, but whether they had had the effect we expected he could not say, that the opposing statements were so contradictory that it was very difficult to decide between the parties, that the fact seemed to be that the government of the islands was administered by foreigners, and that there was a continual struggle between two parties bitterly hostile to each other to obtain the control. All he could tell me at present was that a person had been appointed as consul general, that he would leave as soon as possible for the islands, and had been instructed in relation to the adjustment of the difficulties. He said further that the Foreign Office had just been informed that the King of the Sandwich Islands had granted to an American blank assignia, which gave him power to dispose of all the lands at the islands. If such were the case, it showed a weakness on the part of the king, which demonstrated his unfitness to rule. I replied that I would at once deny the truth of any such charge, not from my present knowledge of the facts, but from my knowledge of the king's character, and that I would pledge myself to disprove the charge within 12 hours. I then made an urgent appeal through him to Lord Aberdeen to allow the commissioners to be heard, and to have the case settled in London, in order that their pending negotiations with other powers might not be embarrassed. Mr. Addington promised to repeat our conversation to Lord Aberdeen and to let us know the determination of the government in regard to the proposed reference as soon as possible. On my return from this interview, I related its substance to my fellow envoys, and they approved of the views I had urged upon Mr. Addington, that it would be for the interest of both nations to have the new consul general begin his career unembarrassed by all these old claims which had brought the Hawaiian government to the brink of ruin, and agreed with me that strong effort should be made to have the troubles all settled before he should leave for his post. Mr. Brinsmaid was justly indignant at the charge made against the king in regard to the blank assignia of power to sell Hawaiian lands, and laid before me the king's contract with Ladd and Company and all the documents relating to the organization of the Belgian company under that contract. They were as complete an answer as I had supposed to Lord Aberdeen's charges. I wrote immediately to Mr. Addington requesting another interview and permission to bring with me the American referred to by the charges. I received a prompt reply appointing an interview at 2 the next day, whereupon we prepared another letter to the Earl of Aberdeen. On Tuesday the 15th, punctual to appointment, Mr. Addington received us at the Foreign Office. I introduced Mr. Brinsmaid as the American who held the contract which had been so misrepresented to the Foreign Office, and who would read it and explain to Mr. Addington the steps which had been taken under it. Mr. Addington was evidently taken by surprise by my prompt production of the contract and its holder, and still more so on seeing for himself its nature and terms, which were simply to the effect that the king granted these lands and privileges on condition that a joint stock company should be formed, the stock of which should be offered for sale in England, France, and the United States, providing that the king's sovereignty should be guaranteed and his rights amply secured. This, of course, was complete disapproval of the charge that the king had sold his sovereignty or shown any partiality to the United States. Mr. Addington, on reading the contract and hearing Mr. Brinsmaid's report of his action in furtherance of it, expressed his satisfaction that the matter had been misrepresented. I followed up this advantage by urging the equal falseness of the other charges of national partiality on the part of the king, and stated that the appointment of Dr. Judd of the American Mission as the king's prime minister, an appointment which had been instanced as proof of such partiality, had in fact been made at the suggestion of an Englishman, Sir George Simpson. Mr. Addington asked me how it was that the Americans seemed to prefer French occupation to that of the English. I replied that the Americans did not fear French competition, but that they felt that if the English took possession, their trade would be ruined. This idea seemed rather gratifying to British pride. Mr. Addington requested a copy of the King's contract with Ladd and Company for the satisfaction of Lord Aberdeen, and informed us that the council was then deliberating upon the Sandwich Islands question, and that we should know its decision at as early a period as possible. I returned to our rooms, copied the contract, and sent it to the Foreign Office the same evening. We felt that the end of our warfare was at hand. On Wednesday, August 16th, we sent another dispatch to the Foreign Office, urging in the strongest possible terms that the decision of the government should be made here in London, so that its new representative at the islands might enter upon his duties with a clean-swept field. We thought that Lord Aberdeen would by this time be glad to decide the matter to get rid of us, and that on receiving his last dispatch from St. Paul's Coffee House, St. Paul's Churchyard, he would exclaim, "Hark, from the tombs a doleful sound." We formally proposed in this letter to submit the whole matter to the decision of the law advisers of the Crown, confident of British love of fair play. The same day, I received a note from Mr. Addington appointing an interview for the next. The interview was a most satisfactory one. Our proposal was accepted, and we received from Lord Aberdeen, through the Under-Secretary, very satisfactory assurance that we had made out our case, that the Sandwich Islands had been misrepresented, and that the British government would do it justice. My own share of the work was accomplished. Leaving my associates to receive the formal announcement of the government's decision, which was rendered in accordance with its pledges, I caught the first steamer, Britannia, April 20th, to Boston, where I took unto myself a wife, and embarked with her for the Sandwich Islands, November 12th, on the good ship Congaree. Our wedding journey of 5 months at sea without sight of land, I commend to all young married couples as the most efficient method of getting acquainted with each other. After the usual perils and pleasures of a Cape Horn passage, we arrived April 8th off Diamond Head, the whole cost of my embassy to the Court of St. James and return having amounted to $1,995.95 in firewood, an account which would compare quite favorably, I imagine, with those of other royal ambassadors. Neither the king's finances nor my own private means justified any display on the occasion of his ambassador's successful return, but he sent his own double canoe to bring my bride and myself on shore, where we were received with open arms and cordial greeting by the king and all loyal to his cause. The news of the success of my embassy had, of course, been anticipated by the overland mail which bore my dispatches. My own emotions were unutterable on again seeing the Hawaiian flag floating over the palace and the shipping. On landing, the first news I heard was that Admiral Thomas, in command of the English squadron in the Pacific, had hastened down immediately on receiving Lord Paulette's dispatches, and the urgent letters of his old friend Mr. Barron from Tepic, had restored the islands on the 31st of July, 1843, to the sovereignty of their rightful king with imposing ceremonies. Amidst the boom of cannon from all the vessels in the harbor, including Carrisfort, the British flag was lowered and the Hawaiian colors hoisted on every available flagstaff in the city, the British landing and saluting them. Admiral Thomas was, however, too careful of British interests and his own position to give up the islands except as pending decision of the British government, and meanwhile took up his residence in Honolulu, ready to seize them again if such should be his orders. England herself lingered over the negotiations chiefly to make time to assure herself that France would not run off with the bon morceau if she dropped it. The Consul General appointed by England, General Miller, arrived in due time at the islands, and succeeding events amply proved the wisdom of our desire to have the questions and disputes settled before his coming. The one point left open by the decision of the Foreign Office took years to settle, roused much ill feeling, and was not finally adjusted according to the facts, in the opinion of those longest conversant with them, through the Consul General, did the best that could be expected of a stranger in his position. Mr. Alexander Simpson retired after the failure of his magnificent schemes into the Highlands of Scotland, and there disappeared from public view after writing a book of bitter denunciation of the British government for letting this brilliant prize slip through the fingers into which he had drawn it, and as he stated in a letter to the London Times, putting more faith in the representations of a Yankee shopkeeper than in those of a British subject. An account by James Fowle Baldwin Marshall in the September 1883 edition of Harper's New Monthly Magazine, an unpublished chapter of Hawaiian history. Harper's New Monthly Magazine, September 1883. An original account from James Fowle Baldwin Marshall on the events of Timoteo Ha'alilio and a failed British scheme to possess Hawaii as a crown colony.